Our next speaker is Ken Mitchell. Ken is professor of geography here at Rutgers and is joining us this morning. His work really is in kind of the human dimensions of natural hazards, of which I know he counts climate change among those. So,
well, thank you, Bob. And I also want to thank, as others have done, Archer St. Clair for inviting me here today. And I want to confess right off the bat that I'm not a specialist in cultural landscape studies. I'm a geographer who spent the past 40 years looking at the human responses to natural hazards in Europe and North America and East Asia and even down under. And my comments on cultural landscapes are from the perspective of someone who wants to build bridges between the hazards research and management field and the cultural landscapes field. And today what I want to do is to examine one particular set of possibilities for cooperation that asks not what hazard scholars can do for cultural landscape studies, but reverses that question and asks what it is that you can do for hazards research. At various times, I've been a member of quick response disaster study teams that have a somewhat different conception of preservation than is commonly found in the cultural heritage field. These teams are typically comprised of engineers, natural and social scientists charged with gathering perishable information about the performance of natural systems and societal ones in the hours, days, and weeks around the time a disaster strikes. The rationale for dispatching these teams is that they can collect information about the early stages of disaster that's vital to understanding later phases of recovery, during which the patterns of vulnerability are emerging that'll be present when the next extreme event comes along. And very often, this includes a great deal of information about happenings that leave very few material traces in the landscape. But it's nonetheless information that's vital to understanding the path that the landscape followed to get to its present state. A number of speakers at this meeting have pointed out the importance of coordinating cultural landscape preservation with strategies followed by other global conventions and programs. And I want to say a few words about that theme as it pertains to coordination between cultural landscape interest groups and disaster risk reduction interest groups. These are two types of groups that have different agendas, employ different assumptions, and use different operating procedures. Cooperation between them will only be successful if it benefits both partners. Now, it's easy to see what the benefits for cultural landscape preservationists are. They get reinforcement from specialists who can provide expert information about climate change and the risks that threaten cherished places, and can supply advice about appropriate ways of countering those risks. But what might the disaster risk reduction community get out of this collaboration? I would contend that the kind of cooperation that would be most welcome among folks who study and manage climate change risks is for heritage preservation groups to find and showcase successful examples of coping with hazard that have stood the test of time at different heritage sites. At a time when greenhouse gas reduction measures are bogged down in political controversy, we need to expand alternatives for living with and adapting to the atmospheric changes that seem destined to occur. Since we're not doing a very good job at publicizing these stories, especially the long history of successfully living with risk in many places, this is an obvious gap that could be well filled by World Heritage sites around the world. But for this to happen, we probably need to change some of the ways the World Heritage System currently operates. The last 400 years of New Jersey's history is illustrative of the complexities involved in interpreting the historical record of human engagement with environmental hazards. Basically, we have had different degrees of success coping with the suite of physical risks that afflict us. Some of the progress that has been achieved is due to deliberate actions taken to avoid or prevent or reduce those risks and the vulnerabilities that attend them. This includes actions that were taken during the disruptive emergencies and actions that occurred during the periods of quiescence and stability that separated them. But also important were broad societal processes that were ongoing in society and were only loosely connected with the experience of the hazards themselves. I'm speaking here about the reconfiguration of livelihoods and transportation networks and land uses and the process of migration into areas at risk. Over 4 centuries, the relationship between people and hazards has been highly dynamic. Some of this is visible in today's cultural landscape, and some of it is not. However, the entire process of intervening in hazards has become much more complex and finely targeted during that 400-year period. I think it's a story that's worth telling through the medium of heritage sites, and one that would likely recruit a larger constituency to the cause of climate risk reduction. Well, what sort of climate change risks are we facing? This slide, I think, suggests that there's a very large menu of possibilities out there, and you can see various kinds of extreme events that may or may not be affected by climate change. The best available evidence that we have about whether those possibilities are going to occur comes from the 4th assessment of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This set of documents not only makes predictions, but attaches levels of confidence to many of those predictions. For example, in the last analysis, the 2007 assessment, you see that it looks like high latitudes seem to be particularly at increased risk of heat waves and floods, although mid-latitudes and the tropics are also likely to experience worsening storms and droughts. And there's a 5th assessment which is on its way to us, which will be more detailed, more definitive, and it's due to start emerging in 2014. So what is the World Heritage community doing in response to these kinds of threats? In 2007, they signed on to a strategy for risk reduction that is intended to mainstream concerns about heritage in national plans for risk reduction and to adopt risk reduction measures at World Heritage sites. Now, I think it might be somewhat early to start looking for evidence that the sorts of innovations that are called for here have actually begun to take hold. But I've made a survey, admittedly an introductory survey, of the 960-some World Heritage sites to identify whether the degree to which hazard appears in those sites, and particularly human engagement with hazard, and how much help it might be to the people in the disaster risk reduction community that I come from. And what I've concluded is that the results are not altogether encouraging, that disaster risk reduction has a lot to learn here. The presence of earthquakes and volcanoes and floods is often mentioned in World Heritage Site materials, but it's almost entirely insofar as they contribute to shaping the physical environment or as agents of destruction. If the human engagement with natural risks is featured at all, it's mostly in the context of hazards that are not likely to be affected by climate change, things like volcanism and seismicity, rather than the storms, floods, and droughts and other hydroatmospheric processes. The few exceptions are a special class of structural responses that include technological systems like terracing, water storage cisterns, irrigation, and dike building that generally took centuries to evolve, and almost entirely missing are examples of places where there were non-structural adjustments that affected the ways human beings arrange their behavior and the institutions that they use, both in the aftermath of disasters and at other times. For example, most of the very marked reduction in disaster deaths that has occurred in many countries during the 20th century is the result of improved observation, monitoring, prediction, warning, and evacuation systems that leave little in the way of material imprints on the visible landscape. Where are the warning systems in the catalogue of World Heritage Sites? I couldn't find any. The next 4 slides show examples of the more common portrayal of human engagement with natural extremes in World Heritage sites. Here's one with various water and drought adaptation structures in the Negev Desert. Another World Heritage site in the Netherlands, focusing on the windmills that were used to pump the water to drain the polders that complemented the dike system. Here we have a site in Guangdong province in China with towers that were used in part as flood refuge sites over the last 4 centuries. So safe shelters, another kind of structural adjustment to risk and hazard. And here's a site on the southern shores of the Baltic Sea where the emphasis is on what people have done to stabilize the dunes, generally through forms of geoengineering. It's instructive, I think, to view these kinds of portrayals of human engagement with risk and hazard against the full range of measures that might be undertaken to reduce risks and hazards. And the ones that appear in the World Heritage Sites are the ones in yellow on this diagram. And you'll see they're heavily concentrated into the bottom category, which is modifying physical risks that involve generally forms of engineering. And what is missing from this list is the sorts of things that would encourage a shift to focusing on human-centered risk reduction actions. That's kinds of things that are widely advocated now by the disaster risk reduction community. So you don't see these in the World Heritage Sites. What you see are the formerly widespread practice of using engineering adjustments to deal with risks and hazards that's largely being put into a secondary position now in hazard and disaster management. A fuller representation of natural hazards in World Heritage landscapes, I think, might have some clear benefits. It could assist the public and influential opinion leaders in the cultural preservation movement to form a more accurate picture of the complexities that attend creation of hazardscapes, as well as other kinds of cultural landscapes. And I would just point out from this list that the second point, showing how cultural landscapes are really a dialogue between disjunctive events that punctuate normality, as it were, the long-term stability, and that set up contingencies that facilitate various kinds of emergent behavior and encourage improvisation, something that doesn't get a lot of coverage in most World Heritage sites. And last but not least in this list is the fact that I think if disaster professionals and cultural landscape preservation professionals were to get together, it would materially assist us in the disaster reduction field with dealing with what I think is the third sovereign problem of natural hazards. The first one, which is just listed here at the top, is the question of uncertainty. And that's been where most of the effort has been devoted by science in the last century or so. The second one is the question of complexity, which is something that has been reflected in a great many of the presentations at this conference. Complexity here means not just the risks that are posed by nature, but the ways in which exposure and vulnerability and protective actions and resilience interact with each other to create a dialogue with those natural risks. But the third question is the question that I think now is the one that is looming large in hazards research studies. And that is the question of ambiguity. And that's, I think, a subject about which the cultural heritage community, especially those that are familiar with the problem of representation in art and other areas of life, may be significantly familiar with. So it's becoming evident that many of the risks that we face are ambiguous, and I could go into some length about that, but won't in the interest of saving time. We need, in the disaster risk reduction community, all the help we can get in resolving issues of ambiguity, and I think that's an area where people in this audience could help a great deal. So thank you.